Hi, this is the Week 4 review video. I'm going to go over some of the main work you did in the discussion boards, the quiz, and the midterm, and help you understand where we're at this point in the class, which will help you put your final touches in the last week and a half. So the thing I'm trying to make clear to you in order to analyze constitutional law and issues that come up in constitutional law is that there's a system contradiction. Part of this is, just a historical truth, right? That the group that intended to write the Constitution that we're all governed by were white, land-owning, many slave-owning individuals who didn't believe that women had equal rights, who didn't believe that people of color had equal rights, who didn't believe that Catholics had equal rights, right? There was a lot of people they were excluding, and so that was embedded into the system. The system was intended to control those groups of people and benefit white male Englishmen to the detriment of others. And so you have to understand the thing that they were concerned about, that group, was how to protect their property. And that was largely because many of them saw the English crown, right, the king and queen of England, as a threat to their property. And so that's what they designed the constitutional system for. So it's not a constitutional system that values human rights. Like if you were to look at the European Union, the English Constitution, the South African Constitution, the Brazilian Constitution, the Ecuador Constitution, right? Constitutions that have developed over the last 100 years or so have tended to focus on human rights, whereas the United States Constitution really wasn't concerned with human rights. It was concerned with property rights. So property has not just meant like the right to own a building, or the right to own an apartment or piece of land. It's also meant the right to have power over other human beings, whether you own them outright directly like slaves, or whether you own them in the way that we think about employees today, that you have power over those human beings, and the Constitution protects your power against those people. So, those, if you're an employee or if you're a slave or if you're an indentured servant or any of these categories, or if you're a prisoner, right? You don't have many rights. You have a few rights, but you don't have as many rights as the people who hold a power position over you. So just to remind you, this is a system design, right? So this isn't accidental. This isn't just the way things are. This was the way that they wanted to design the system. And if you're curious about that, or if you're skeptical about what I'm saying, you can always read the Federalist Papers, where they go into pretty explicit detail of not just how the system is supposed to work, but why they think it is supposed to work, because there were several people at that time that were saying, we don't like this system, it threatens our individual rights, and we don't want to have that happen. And so there was a debate going on, and through the constitutional process, right, the winners were the people who wanted to protect the property system. So any rights you do have that are given to you in the Constitution or in the amendments, or through congressional acts or through state legislatures, are restricted to individualism. Now, this is, again, because that's the system. The system itself does not recognize group rights. It recognizes your individual rights. So you have to bring that claim. The problem with that, if you remember from Hannah Arendt and from Michael McCann, is that leaves you pretty powerless, right? You're only one person against the entire state or against an entire group of people. And so they're only really powerful when you're mobilized with other people, right? So you have to have a collection of individuals that have to bring those claims in order for it to have any power, to have any impact. Now, even when you're able to do that, you're going up against the system that benefits, that gives white men a head start. And so they've got more resources, they've got greater access, and they've got more information about the system, largely that's passed on from generation to generation. But also because people, if you think about it, before you took this class, you might have been thinking everybody's equal, the system is going to equal everybody out. That myth, that story that we tell, gives an additional advantage to white men. Because when a white man comes into a space, everybody believes that, everybody was equal, that they all worked hard and they all earned everything together. What you should now be seeing from a systems perspective is not true, right? White men get an advantage. It doesn't mean they don't have any problems, right? But they have this advantage or a head start in the race. So this means that white males choose, right? They don't have to choose. They could just go along with the system and continue to benefit, or they could say that they're ignorant and they don't know what's happening. Or they could choose to resist, and they could try to change it. They could participate in ways of challenging the system and sharing their power and sharing their benefits. Now, other group identities also make that same choice, but only if they're aware of the contradiction. You'll hear a lot of minoritized people believing in essentially the white male system, the same system that benefits the white males and harms them. They believe in it. They think it's a good thing. So as long as they're doing that, then what are they doing? They're choosing to benefit or trying to benefit from a system that has greater benefits being given to white men. Or if they're aware of it, then they are more likely to start to resist that system and try to mobilize against it. So I want to have this be then kind of a way that you start over here in the left-hand corner where you didn't necessarily think about these things, or you didn't see yourself within the system, and that as you start to document and share your points, especially around standpoint theory, you're starting to develop your identity in relation to other people. And so there's a few assignments that were given to you that help you go through this, largely on the sovereignty side, that get you to start trying to articulate where do you see yourself. And many of you had a contradictory position. You want the power to be to the quote-unquote people, which is impossible to define, right, in an unequal system. Not everyone is equal. Let's assume you meant you. You wanted you to be part of that people, and you wanted that power. You have to then try to articulate or explain how you're going to use that power when other people are trying to use their power against you. And if you don't have equal power, now we're starting to help you see that you're going to have to work with other people, and you have to learn more about the system in order to be an agent of change, to have an agent of power. And so you've been working this out through the discussions, and this is where you're sharing and reflecting, and you're starting to come up to your own positions and statements of where you recognize the contradiction and see where you are in this structure. So, I thought it was interesting when you gave all of your individual power away to me for grading, right? And you do that every semester. And some of you might be thinking, oh, well, that's just the way things are, but it's not true. There's colleges, Evergreen State College, even Harvard, where the student has much more of an independent role in determining their own grade, right? It tends to be in public schools and in community colleges where the professors tend to act like dictators, where they tell you exactly what your grade is and what you have to do. And many of you just go along with that. Well, that contradicts with your idea of sovereignty being shared among the people, right? If you believed in that, if you believed in sovereignty being shared among the people, let's say you believe in through voting and through representatives, then you would vote and have a representative of the class who would help determine the grades along with the professor. That would be a consistent view of sovereignty. So many of you are having to wrestle these different positions that you haven't necessarily thought about and try to understand what is your constitution. How do you see rights? How do you see domination? How do you see the negotiation between those two? And so we're trying to get you to this larger place where you start to have an understanding and you start to have a dialogue, or you discuss, discourse, deliberate. There's all these same words for the same thing. With other people, and then that's the ideal, right? And in that sense, if everybody has the same knowledge, if everybody now understands that there's inequity, that the system is creating contradictions, now people have their own autonomy. They're able to move within that system, to collaborate, to reject inequality, and start to revise their actions. So I have to, put this out there, is that when I ask you to use language from the judges, right, you're better at it oftentimes than they are, and you're better at it than a lot of white politicians. And so the question that typically comes up is, why is this so hard for white people to talk about? In fact, every semester I teach this class, there's at least one white student, or one student who identifies as being white, who expresses some form of discomfort in having to talk about race, right? They're obviously not seeing that this is something that every other group, people who are not white, have to talk about constantly, right? When they go to classes, they're constantly learning about white people, white values, white history, and they're not expressing the same discomfort. And why do I always have to talk about white people, right? So you can see that white people struggle with this, and social psychologists even have a term for this called white fragility. And the simple answer, as a white male, I can tell you, is that white people don't have to think about this, right? They're in a system designed for and benefits to white people, particularly white men. So when they're forced to confront this, it's an uncomfortable experience. And so this is something you need to think about. If the majority of people in power positions are white, they believe that they've earned their privilege, they're going to have a really hard time recognizing the inequality. It's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of consciousness building and a lot of mobilization to get them to even see there is a problem. Whereas many of you who have experienced discrimination you were pretty quick to be able to see who benefits and who's harmed. So you want to keep that in mind when you're thinking about this constant systemic contradiction. Now, what I thought was interesting as well is that you were very, very good, most of you, when you compared and contrasted the three readings. And I really love that you all kind of saw different things, right? And so I think just to highlight a few of these ideas is that you saw how these three individuals who we often celebrate, right? So not everybody is able to accomplish everything that they did, and it's not just through hard work, right? It's through some luck, it's through some family support, other cultural support, and the support they got through education. And so what I liked is that you saw that they were struggling, right? It wasn't simple for them. It wasn't easy. It wasn't like a lot of wealthier people who get to go to a nice school. They don't have to work, right? They're just going to college. They're living on campus. They're getting a weekly check to pay for anything they want, right? They have that head start constantly in society, and that's maintaining this unequal situation. The other side that I think you did well is that these individuals understood how they were being harmed, and they understood how they were being discriminated against because of the color of their skin, or because of their gender, or because of their political beliefs, and they used those discrimination situations to help get other people who have experienced a similar thing and help them go against that system. And so they use that awareness, that understanding, to form their own identities, and then not to just succumb to it, not just to let it happen to them, but to then coordinate and organize with other people in order to overcome those. And then I think it's great that you were able to see this. This is really good evidence that you're looking at the systems level, where oftentimes people say, well, just work hard and you'll get what you want. Well, that's not true, right? You obviously have to work hard. I mean, that's a reality of everybody. But some people have to work harder than others, right? And some people don't have to work very hard at all. We even have a saying, right? Hardly working. And so it's something to recognize, and that helps you understand your agency, that it's not just how hard you work, it's kind of how you're working and who you're working with. And then I thought it was really great that you were able to see that there were three different points of view. So even though they had some similarities because of their identities, right, whether they were male, whether they were a female, whether they were growing up in the Bronx, whether they're in the South, whether they were in California, that these all had a part of their experience, right? It's not a single situation, right? That there's discrimination that occurs in a variety of ways, and oftentimes at once, right? It's not one at a time, but you'll be discriminated against because you're a woman and because you're a person of color. You'll be discriminated against because you're a Latino and because you're a working class person, right? That there'll always be, usually what they call intersecting, multiple ways that discrimination acts out. So this should take you back to the earlier two readings where you learned that, well, yes, we know this from social science, that law and equality is a reality in America, and that it's always changing, right? So it's not, in some ways things are quote unquote better, but in some ways they're worse. And so it's not like time itself is going to solve all these problems, right? People have to be involved in constructing new ways of thinking about law and about how to mobilize rights. Now this then contrasts to who can claim rights, right? Now the point here is that if you're a person of color, or if you've been discriminated against, it's easier to claim rights if you're working with other people, or you're working with an organized group, say the NAACP or the ACLU or the Brennan Center for Rights, right? Reaching out, or tenants, even a tenants' rights group, right? It's better if you're working with a group of people than if you try to do it individually. But keep in mind, right, that the court wants you to recognize it individually. And so there's this contrast, there's this tension that's kind of going back and forth. And that's because of the stratification, because we're in an unequal society, that you're going to have to work differently depending on where you're at in that society. So I would want to see this in your midterm responses, right? And the people who did this, you're going to see a boost in your final grade. And so we want to see the tension, we want to see inequality. You don't want to be race neutral or colorblind, right, where you're pretending that there are no problems. You want to be able to see how the inequality affects different people and who it harms and who it benefits. Once you're able to do this, then you'll be able to see how the people are then using rights consciousness. In what ways are they thinking about rights? Are they saying, I have a right and I'm going to go organize with other people? Are they going to the court and filling out paperwork to say you violated a right? Are they going to their legislator and they're saying you can't do this because you don't have the right, right? How are they using rights language? What are they deciding to do? Mobilization, how are they deciding to work with each other? How is this work going against or resisting social control? Remember, social control, sometimes you want to see it as a good thing. And in an ideal society, you wouldn't need social control, right? And so social control is when one group goes against the norms of another group. Now, sometimes that can be pretty consistent norms, like we would all prefer that people don't rob or murder people, right? But on the other hand, it can also be used in ways that aren't so simple and not so black and white, right? They can be used in the way, well, we think these are the kind of people that might rob and murder people, and we can do that because they have different norms than us. They listen to different music, they talk differently, they wear different clothing, and so therefore we're going to control them before they ever have the chance, right? And so you can see it's a very slippery slope once you start going down the road of social control. You're very unlikely to have an ideal situation. You're much more likely to have abuse of that power of social control. So even in the historical concept of the founding fathers, they wanted to limit social control because they didn't want anyone to take away their private property. We're a long way from that. And so even within the system, you can see how trying to maintain the system itself is benefiting one group, and that group is trying to control others in a variety of ways. And then so you want to just think about how people then use this as a way to start to understand their own standpoint, and how they start to resist this abuse of law or this abuse of power, and how they use that same thinking about law and power back up against the person who's abusing it. And so it's this kind of back and forth that exists. And I'm really trying to caution you on thinking that there's going to be a resolution here, that there's one law to rule them all, or one perfect way of existing that everybody's going to experience. It's just not very realistic. And there's no evidence of it in any society anywhere in the history of the world. And so putting out the idea that we're all equal is nice. It's a great bumper sticker, right? It's a great meme, but it's not real. It's not a thing that actually exists here on this planet Earth. So to put this in a different way on the quiz, right, rights consciousness is experience or learning about injustice. Now, certainly, right, experiencing about injustice is a pretty quick way to say, hey, wait a second, this isn't right. But you can learn about other people's experiences. So even if you haven't had an experience of injustice, say with the police, when you read about people's experiences or you see it on TV, you should be able to learn from that, and that should help you think about rights aren't always fair, right? People's rights are often violated. You wouldn't need rights if there wasn't abuse of power. The same thing goes with legal mobilization, right? The tools available to people are to try to overthrow the system, to work towards a more equitable social order, to use the system against other people, right? There's rules that kind of occur within the system that people can use. And so legal mobilization is that process of trying to work towards a more equitable social order. Now, some of the readings that you had, right, were trying to get you to the nuts and bolts, or the building pieces, to help you better understand this. And this is, I'm checking to see how well you understood those readings in the quizzes, right? So you can see a lot of people struggled with the idea of originalism, right? Justice Scalia believed, and the 6 court justices right now believe, that there should be one rule, and their rule, right? Their way of defining things, and it should be fixed, meaning it shouldn't change at all. And they want this because they want, just like the property system, they want it to be consistent and predictable, right? So they've borrowed that from kind of business talk and the property economics, and they've said, we want the law to be that way, which that means is they want a law that's going to be fixed to the private property system, right? And so they don't want to have to think about human rights. They don't want to have to think about fundamental rights. They don't want to have to think about autonomy. They only want to think about things that have to do with the system. So a lot of people struggle with that because they want the belief to be, well, they think, well, of course, law should have a dynamic meaning based on the context and time. That could be your belief, and that's, Justice Ginsburg had that belief. Sotomayor has that belief. Kagan has that belief. Ketanji Brown Jackson has that belief, right? But that's not Scalia, and it's not the majority of the Supreme Court, right? It's not members of the Republican Party either. So you've got multiple definitions of law based on their politics and based on their experiences and their identity. So the main threshold concept then for learning about constitutional law is malleability of law. And see, again, people struggle with this. Sovereignty is an important idea, and it helps you understand the malleability of law. In other words, right, once you start to understand there's multiple ways of thinking about who should be in charge of your life, then you're better understanding of how is that going to work out in court, what arguments you're going to have to use, and you're going to understand there's going to be 4 or 5 different arguments you can draw from within a court. And so the law changes back and forth based on those arguments. An example of domination of social control violating constitutional rights in the reader was the Korematsu versus the United States, right, where the United States violated pretty much every principle of the Constitution because they thought Japanese people might be, not that they had evidence or that they, none of these people were ever sent to court or had any kind of a trial. They just gathered up people that they thought were Japanese, including some people who were not Japanese, and put them in prisons in order to, in the name of national security, right? And so this was an example of one group, white people, using the legal system to dominate and socially control a minoritized group. We see this happen again recently in Trump versus Hawaii, where the court says once again, to the executive branch, well, you can exclude people from Muslim countries even though that violates the constitutional rights because they were shown to be a danger to national security because of their nationality. Now, I think any of us can argue, right? We can decide politically whether that's right or wrong. But what you can't do, and this is what we mean by the malleability of law, is you have to use the legal arguments. And so what Trump versus Hawaii did was they looked back at Korematsu and said, look, we've done this 5 or 6 times in America's history. And so their argument, the court said, it's not the place of the court to decide whether the people are actually dangerous. It's the job of the president, the Department of Defense, NSA. It's their job. And so we shouldn't second guess them. If they say that these people are dangerous, then we should just believe them and not require any evidence. Some of us look at that and say, wow, that's crazy, right? A court is supposed to decide whether people are dangerous, whether they violated the law. But this interpretation, the originalist interpretation, is saying, let's let the courts and let's let the voters handle that. And in this case, the voters did, right? They voted Trump out and they voted somebody else in. And they voted a lot of Democrats into the Senate and the House. And so, in some ways, the political system will work these things out. But this did nothing for those people who were not shown at all to be dangerous, right? They weren't allowed to come into this country. And to this day, the immigration system right now is favoring white Christian countries to the detriment of all the other countries, if you want to look that up online. So the last 2 slides really kind of just try to pull this all together then. And so in order to analyze the structure of constitutional law, and structure we mean relationships of real human beings within it, and not just words in the Constitution, but how they actually apply to real human beings, you have to understand that we participate in this construction of unequal social relations. And you're either doing that because you're going along with it, you're not questioning it, you're not resisting it, or you're participating in resisting and trying to make a change. You're trying to make things more equal. You're trying to improve your own position. You're trying to get yourself more resources, right? There's this tension going back and forth between social control that keeps the domination going and resistance that is trying to make a change. Now, this really matters, right, in especially the criminal law side of things, is that we now have evidence from neuroscience that people have different understandings of what good and bad are, right? And I think you're seeing this, as there's multiple cases have kind of been coming up about, a lot of different cases actually in the last year. Vigilantism on the subway. A woman had a miscarriage, and then what she did with the remains, right? They're judging her based on that. They say that's wrong what she did. A case in which recently in Brooklyn, right, a child committed suicide, and there might have been instances of bullying and a policy that was promoting that kind of behavior. Well, we have to understand that courts are not going to be able to do a very good job of figuring out the social context, right? That's what social scientists do. And so you're going to need people in the world who are going to start trying to explain how the social construction of unequal social relations affects the court system. And that's Barrett is one of these people. There's others, right? But that could be a direction you go for your career. There'd be lots and lots of jobs out there after you get your degree to try to help people better understand that different cultures have different meanings and how this applies to the court system. And of course, email me if you want more information about that. So I then wanted to add, and as we go into the last week and a half here, as you're really leaning towards your final thinking on this, is it's never done. There's not one right answer in a legal class. Or a criminal justice class for that matter, right? It's not a math class. There's not one answer at the back of the book that's going to explain how you solve, a certain problem. And so I just wanted to highlight 3 issues here, right? I think this person is thinking through, right, that they're seeing the historical side of this, that 200 or 300 years ago, there were some legal issues that seem to have gotten better. They've gotten a little bit of resolution, but then there's other issues that still seem like they aren't being addressed. And so is there ever going to be a situation in which everybody's going to be satisfied? I think that the short answer, of course, right, is that, well, in dictatorships, everybody's satisfied or they die or they get thrown in jail, right? So you better say you're satisfied. In a democracy, everybody gets to participate in what they think is satisfactory. And so it's a good thing that people have different perspectives because people have different experiences. It's a bad thing that there's so much inequality, but simply having a dictatorship isn't going to end the inequality. You have to have more people participating, and you have to give people more access, and they have to have more say in the participation in order for there to be less, right? So you have to change that social construction. You have to have more people participate, and frankly, you need to have fewer white males dominating in the political positions, in the courts, right, in education, et cetera, et cetera. And so what amendments are under the risk of being rephrased or up to date? I think what you're seeing from the present Supreme Court is that all of the 14th Amendment cases are open to reinterpretation, from Brown versus Board of Education to Roe v. Wade. They're going through a lot of cases that are going to get revised, rephrased, rewritten. You saw recently in the affirmative action case that the court is not interested in trying to allow for there to be equity in society. They want that to be done by individuals. So they have no understanding of unequal society, or they pretend not to. Another question I think is, this is interesting, is it that democracy fails in countries where basic human rights are not observed? I think that's a great question. That's a question of a student, I think, that should really focus on this when they transfer in their junior and senior year and really have that be a study. I think there's a lot of careers that you could go in that direction to answer those questions. I think there's a lot of internships you could do, United Nations, for example, where this is a great question. I think anytime you see in a country where police are violating human rights, whether it's the United States, whether it's Guatemala, whether it's South Africa, whether it's Taiwan, right? I think you have to wonder, right? Is that political system a democracy, or is it something else, right? Who's benefiting in that system? More and more political scientists, especially, are starting to think about the concept of oligarchies, right? A small group of people that are controlling the larger group. Especially as there's more and more wealth generated to the top and fewer rights being granted to the people at the bottom. So this isn't an easy answer, My quick answer would be you need to think of things as not black and white, but a spectrum, right? And so let's say on the low end, if human rights are being violated every day for pretty much every group of people, then I think we're good at saying that's not a democracy, right? That's a dictatorship. On the other hand, this doesn't exist, but in a place where everybody gets equal participation, everybody has equal access, everybody has equal resources, and everybody has equal knowledge, well, that's an ideal democracy, right? That'd be great. And so I think countries will be located somewhere on that line, right? Some will be more towards the middle part, more toward the not a democracy, and more towards, they're getting there, right? But I don't think, you have many examples. I think the thing that's scary, I think, in the United States for a lot of people is that the U.S. seems to be going towards the dictatorship route. Fewer and fewer rights for people at the bottom, and more power and wealth going to people at the top. But this is a thing that goes back and forth over time, right? And it really depends on, to be blunt, essentially people under 50, right? People under 50 and how they start to think about it. If you've got a lot of young people that are kind of buying into the same thing that the 70-year-olds are saying, which I'm shocked to be seeing, but a lot of young people, 20 to 30, are really repeating things that 70-year-olds are saying. That's strange. That's an odd thing to be experiencing at this time, right? But people in the 70s, they have a lot of power. They have a lot of, they're controlling political and courts and media. So if people aren't thinking critically about the information they're getting and they're just repeating memes on social media, I wouldn't expect democracy to be moving towards human rights, right? Democracy really requires people to be smart. It requires them to think. It requires them to read. It requires them to have informed discussions and to listen to people they don't agree with. That's not very popular these days. So it's nice to see. It's nice for. I don't expect this actually in some of the comments and questions, but I do get quite a bit of it, and so I should share it, right? Thank you for doing the readings, and we've worked really hard to make sure that these readings cover the important historical issues like racism and gender discrimination. But I've also included cases that have to do with the environmental issues. Property issues, right? The different ways of looking at it. There's a lot of cases about criminal justice issues that you need to be aware of that you're going to see again. And that's a good thing in the criminal justice major, to see things over and over again, because you're not going to learn everything in one semester. And so I think it's good that if you're going through this process of thinking and discussing with each other these dilemmas, and hopefully that's what you'll focus on in the final exam, is really pulling from the readings and applying them, as well as go back and look at the discussions you've had with other students, right? They've been really good this summer. I'm very happy about that. And so draw from those. You can use those as examples in your answers as well. So we're nearing the end of the term. So again, reach out to me if you have any questions, but I do feel good about the progress we've made, most of you have made in this class so far. And so I think you're turning the corner now, and you really want to be focusing on the grading rubrics found in the last week folder, and really look at that right-hand column and really try to memorize as many of those as possible, so that you kind of remember what you're trying to say in your final exam and your final discussion board posts.